I was never around. I was on the road all the time. It took a toll on a number of areas in my life. I think I naively thought that I could have it all.
As someone who gives advice around like the philosophies of life, of how to be happy, of like what is important in terms of figuring out priorities, to then go through this period yourself where you're like, oh, how did we end up here?
It's like, I can't tell you how many times I would like talk to friends during this period. And I'd be like, man, I'm so stressed out and I don't know what to do and blah, 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 blah. And then my friend would look at me and be like, there's this book called
Back for the second time to Life Uncut is one of our absolute favourite writers, Mark Manson. Now, last time you joined the pod, Mark, it was about 3 years ago. You probably don't even remember now. And you were in New Zealand at the time making the feature film, your feature film. You shared an accidentally unfiltered, your embarrassing story from when you were a kid and you ran across the street naked on a dare. Your brother and his friends had stolen your clothes and locked the door. And we had a good old chuckle about that. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for reminding me of that traumatic memory.
The deep trauma that you had suppressed over all these years.
I have been put through a crash course of all the things I don't know and understand about the film industry. The distribution has been completely erratic country to country. Like some countries it's on Netflix, it's everywhere. Other countries you can't find it anywhere. And it's been really complicated because trying to promote it, because anything I say, people from 10 different countries are like, where is it? What are you talking about? I don't see it anywhere. And then people from other countries are like, oh my God, your movie's everywhere. Why don't you ever talk about it? And so it's been very strange.
Before we get into all of the unpacking of relationships, which is what we're going to cover on this podcast, we are not going to let you off scot-free. I am hoping that you've done something since the time you ran naked through the streets to embarrass yourself again.
I was thinking about this earlier because you guys warned me. So, okay, 2019 was maybe one of the busiest years of my career. I was simultaneously working on 3 books at the same time. So my follow-up to Subtle Art was coming out, which is called Everything is Fucked, a book about hope. I was finishing an audiobook original for Amazon, and then I was also starting on the Will Smith book. So all this was happening at the same time, and right in the middle of this, my agent came to me and she said, oh, we're so excited about your book launch. We want to book like a 20 city speaking tour for you. And of course, my dumbass who can't say no to anything was like, sure, that sounds great. And it literally got to be the night before my speaking tour start, and I still didn't have a talk ready. So the first date was in New York City. It was a sold out theater of probably like 600 people. I basically got up on stage and started winging the talk, and I kind of just followed where the chuckles went, and I made a joke about sex robots, and I got a really big laugh, and I'm like, oh, cool. So this is my thing tonight. And so I went on this like
That's a sex robot TED talk.
I went on like a 10-minute diversion in the sex robots, and the place got so quiet. It's so awkward. That I honestly like I didn't think I was gonna recover, and then finally like the MC got on stage. It was like, okay, so
I'm
any
moving
questions?
Wait, did this
So that was the kickoff of my speaking tour of 2019.
I mean, it's a good hard pivot when you've done it once, you know, okay, maybe that gear's not going to land at the next place. I'll change it for the next show. But did this come from like unbridled confidence, or was it just total lack of preparation and like time management?
Complete lack of preparation. Complete. Like it was that first date was a complete and utter disaster. One of the most embarrassing public appearances of my life. The second date was okay. It was hit or miss. I think by like the third or fourth date, I'd kind of gotten a talk together, and then I actually finished the tour in Australia. So by the time I got to Australia, it was like nailed, practiced, knew everything front to back.
Have you ever written about a sex robot? Like, how did that even come in? Because I'm gonna guess you haven't.
I don't know. I mean, I think I started out just kind of going through the ideas of the book. The last chapter is about AI and the future and technology and stuff. And so I think I kind of got through the whole book And I looked down at the clock and there was still 20 minutes left. And I was like, all right, well, we got to fill this somehow.
So fill it with a robot.
And away we went.
You cover like the topics in which you cover, they're so diverse. Most of it comes back down to relationships, but we thought we would navigate this conversation more so around the questions we get asked on our podcast by our listeners and have someone who truly has experience to answer some of them. Now, one of the things that we face pretty often is a conversation around long-term relationships and understanding whether something is just like going through a rocky patch in a relationship or whether it's an irreparable difference, and when to know how to leave a relationship or when you should leave a relationship. For you, what are like the key signs or the key indicators that a relationship has come to the end of its lifespan?
Oh, wow. So I just did a podcast about this. So this is very fresh in my head. First of all, are both people aware of the problem? Because sometimes one person thinks there's a problem and the other person doesn't. Are both people aware there's a problem, and are both people willing to work on it? If one person in the relationship's not willing to work on it, and no matter what you say to that person, it doesn't change their mind, nothing's going to change. There's nothing you can do other than wait around and hope. But it's if both people aren't on the same page and recognizing the problem and being willing to work on the problem, then everything else is just off the table. Like there's not even really anything else to talk about. Nothing's going to change. So assuming both people are on the same page that there's a problem, there's an issue, it needs to be worked on. I think the second question is, in the process of working on the relationship, does it feel like things are getting better or are they getting worse? Because a lot of times what happens is people recognize the problem, they start working on the problem, they start trying to compromise on things, and they actually end up making themselves even more miserable. And to me, that's usually an indication that there are just some very fundamental differences in values or philosophies or wherever each person is in their life. And it's going to be very, very hard to come back from that. Generally speaking, when you are both in a good relationship or a healthy relationship that's going to improve, the more you work on it, the more you get back from it. And obviously, like that, it's not always like that from like the first minute, but generally speaking, within a couple weeks or a few months, you should start feeling things get better and not just worse.
Well, I think that's an important point that you just touched on, and that's like working on a relationship. What do you think about these general, quote unquote, normal ebbs and flows in a relationship, where you go through these times in a long-term relationship where you're like, we're not fighting, like there's nothing wrong, but the chemistry's not there anymore. It's plateaued a little bit. You're just cruising through life, because a lot of people will then write in and say, you know, I feel like we're just living, we're coexisting.
Or it's boring.
It's boring. And, you know, they don't like the idea of having to work on a relationship. People love to say relationships shouldn't be work. It should just be happy and connecting, and this sexual chemistry should just be there. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's unrealistic to think that a relationship is going to be 10 out of 10 in every category until the end of time. Things are going to come and go, you know, things are going to dip to a 6 or a 7 in one category, and then they'll come back a year or two later. They'll dip into a 5 in another category. They'll come back a year later. As long as it's not like a 5 in every category at the same time, you're probably okay. I think it's just a natural process of life. You said something really interesting there, which is, and I hear this a lot too, is people complain that the relationship's not fun anymore. And I think this is a really serious misconception that a lot of people have. Relationships are not supposed to be fun. You're not like going to Disney World. This is life. It's a life partner. That means that they're with you through the sucky and unexciting parts of your life. They're there when you have health problems. They're there when you have career problems. You're there for them when they have family problems. Like there's going to be long stretches that it's not necessarily fun to be together, but you should still like being together. You need something more than just fun keeping you together, because the fun's going to go away at some point.
Yeah, and I think like when you compare the excitement of a new relationship, like it's I think everyone knows this. Everyone knows that it's not something that is consistent and can be maintained. But I think we all want to think that we can have it. Like we all want to think that our relationship will be the exception. And then you get 7 years in and you're like, is this what we've become? But I guess you touched on something earlier. You talked about compromise. And I would love to know in your eyes, like, I guess the balance and how important compromise is in a relationship, but then how do you ensure that you don't lose yourself within that relationship because of compromise?
Compromise is absolutely fundamental to any relationship. I think the important thing to understand about compromise is that it's not about making both people happy all the time. It's about preventing misery. Like my wife is super, super clean and I'm not. I think most relationships have one person who's the clean person and one person who's not. So she has very, very high standards of cleanliness. And it would be unreasonable for me to try to match her expectations perfectly. But what we've realized is that if I just make myself like 10% cleaner, it reduces her stress and pain by like 90%, right? So that's like a really good return. If I just do these things every once in a while, if I just pick this up when I'm done with it, it makes her like 50% happier that day. So those are the sorts of compromises that you want to look for, is like what are the things that it doesn't bother me a whole lot to give up, and but it increases the other person's happiness significantly. I think the mistake a lot of people make is they give up too much. They give up 50% of themselves to make the other person 10% happier. And that's just a terrible trade-off.
So how do you manage that compromise then in a healthy way without losing yourself completely? Because it's easier to appease the masses. Like it's easier to just say yes, even though you don't really want to do it.
Especially if you are a people pleaser.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is just very honest communication about it. And I think the most important thing, I think, is for both people have to realize that you're different people. So you're going to have different standards around stuff. Everybody has different standards around cleanliness, around money, around raising kids, lifestyle preferences, lifestyle habits. Like we're all going to be different. And I think the first thing is that it needs to be okay to be different. You can't judge your partner, or your partner can't judge you for having a different standard of cleanliness or whatever. We just have to understand, like, okay, you have a higher standard of cleanliness. I have a higher standard of spending money, or whatever it is. Once you're able to acknowledge those things in each other, then you can discuss it. That's when you can start finding the compromise. Like, okay, you like to spend more than I do. So what's the amount that I'm fine with that can still make you happy? You like to clean, you want things to be cleaner than I do. So what's the amount that I can get, if I spend 15 minutes a day doing this, this, and this, how much happier will that make you? And it's almost like negotiating in a way.
I would love to know from your perspective. I mean, you receive so many questions, I can only assume, from your listeners and your like people who are like sold in on your teachings. What do you think are the number one relationship or life questions that people are struggling with?
It's so funny because, I would say 2/3 of the relationship questions I get are some permutation of a boundaries issue, of somebody who is taking on too much responsibility for their partner's life, or is allowing their partner to control too much of their own life and isn't aware of it or doesn't realize it. And it shows up in so many different forms. But I personally have found that just a basic understanding around boundaries and communicating strong boundaries within a relationship is like the simple thing that immediately makes a relationship like 80% better.
If you've been like very weak in your boundaries throughout your entire relationship and it's something that's eroded over time, how do you then kick into gear? Okay, Mark Manson says this is going to fix our relationship. How are we going to start implementing some boundaries here? Because I would assume that usually from the person who is breaching those boundaries, they would respond to that poorly.
They usually do, yeah. But so it doesn't, if you take a relationship with really poor boundaries and then you start implementing good boundaries in it, one of two things happens. Either it fixes the relationship and it's kind of an ugly, messy process, or it just ends because the other person is no longer getting what they're there for. But generally, boundaries, like anything, it's starting with the small stuff and working up. I think people generally, if you're a people pleaser or somebody who really, really struggles to have difficult, uncomfortable conversations, then it's best to start with the small, uncomfortable conversations, the little things. Why did you use my car without asking me? Where were you last night? Why didn't you call? Little things like that. And again, it's not, you're not trying to pick a fight, which I think this is a mistake a lot of people make. They're like, oh, he did something wrong or she did something wrong, let me get him for it. It's not about that. It's about, look, you've just been doing shit
Wrong.
Like, whenever you feel like it, without any consequences. I want you to know now that there are going to be consequences. And because that's essentially what a boundary is it's kind of creating like an if then statement for the relationship. If you go out at night and don't call me, then I'm just going to assume the worst. Or if you take my car without permission, I'm going to do XYZ. Like, you have to start implementing rules and consequences. And this makes people who are bad at boundaries, this always makes them feel really uncomfortable because they tend to have these romantic notions of like, well, I don't want to put limits on each other, and we should just be able to like live in harmony. And it's like, no, we're fucking humans, and if you give us an inch, we'll take a mile, and we're fundamentally selfish, even with people that we love. So rules are good for everybody. Rules are good for your partner, and they're good for you, and they make sure that you don't fuck each other over and you don't take advantage of each other. So it's like good to get really clear on them, what you expect from each other, what you'll tolerate, what you won't tolerate in each other, and get on the same page, and then consistently have those conversations that stay on the same page.
Well, what do you think about cheating in a relationship and coming back from cheating in a relationship? Do you think cheating has to be the end of the relationship, or do you think it's something that, you can find forgiveness and can make the relationship better and you can move forward?
I don't think it has to be the end. I think obviously it often is, but I think that the thing that is the end of the relationship that cheating causes is the breach of trust. If cheating happens, the project afterwards it's really about rebuilding trust within the relationship. And it's a very, very difficult process. And obviously a lot of it has to do with the circumstances that the cheating happened under and how each person reacts to it, etc.
Yeah, we were speaking to Esther Perel a little while ago, and she actually changed my mind on it a lot. She spoke about how it doesn't have to be the end of the world. And if you're with a partner long term for upwards of 40, 50, 60 years, that's a long time to have not wanted to wander and experience something else. And it doesn't mean necessarily, and there'll be people that come for me, her, us in this, doesn't mean that you love that person any less, but it does mean that another part of your life, I guess, took over your want for something new and spontaneous and sexy.
Well, see, I think an interesting question off the back of this is we often sort of unpack like, is cheating the end of a relationship? And we kind of go, no, it doesn't have to be, which, it doesn't have to be. I believe that. Have I experienced it? No, it's always been the end of my relationships, to be honest. I think it's easy to say, oh, it doesn't have to be the end of your relationship. You can work through it. But like, it's fucking hard to. And I think anyone who's ever been cheated on realistically would say 99.9% of the times it is the start of the demise. What are the relationships that are different? What are the ones that actually are able to overcome the cheating? Like, what is the thing that if you're cheated on should be the indicator that you can actually work through it rather than knowing, okay, well, this is the beginning of the end?
Well, I think a lot of it boils down to the person who cheated needs to have some degree of understanding or awareness of why they cheated. I think cheating rarely just happens in a vacuum. Like, it's rare that a person simply cheats because they're bored or horny, and there's an attractive stranger next to them, and if it does happen in that circumstance, they're a fucking terrible partner anyway. So that the cheating's not even the biggest issue. Usually cheating happens because there's some other underlying issue that's gone on for a long time and hasn't been discussed or resolved. And so I think a lot of the work around the cheating is to figure out what is actually the motivation here. Like, why would it feel worth it to break that trust that you've built over so many years for just like a simple one night stand or whatever? And that's a really important discussion to have and to figure out. And it can take a long time to figure that out. And it's probably different for a lot of people. So I think if you can get an understanding around that, like if you can get the person who cheats is like, you know what, like I've been really unhappy and depressed for a long time. And, we've grown distant and I feel disconnected from you and I'm just in a bad place. And I met this person and it like, if they show an awareness or an understanding of that, and then you can actually start talking about the more fundamental issue of like, okay, well, why were you depressed? Why were we disconnected? Why weren't you coming to me with these issues before? Why weren't we talking about this? Like, then you can start to rebuild that trust and understanding. But if the person doesn't have that awareness to begin with, then you're probably not going to get anywhere.
But I think boundaries are only going to work and only going to be a positive thing in your relationship if you're actually going to stick to them. Like you have to ask yourself if you are going to stick to these boundaries or not. There's no point setting them and then when it happens, like, my non-negotiable, my boundary is cheating. They cheat. You're like, oh, it's okay because I'm too weak and too scared to be alone and leave. The second that you start to weaken these boundaries, all you're doing is letting your partner know that it's actually okay to do what you want. Like, these boundaries don't mean anything. Like, totally. You can cheat and I'm still going to be here. It takes away anything that it takes away any positive reinforcement that you said at the start, the positive boundaries that you said. You're like, you want me, these are my non-negotiables. If you don't, or you are not going to stick by them, don't set them. That's how I feel about the situation. Because it just lets them, like you just said, they're going to take a fucking mile, right? They're going to run with that as fast as they can. And I think the relationship's only going to get worse. They're not going to respect your boundaries. You're not respecting your own boundaries.
100%. It's words don't mean shit.
No.
And I think
says the writer.
People really overestimate words. They're like, but I told you not to do that. It's like, well, you're not doing anything. It's like if you were raising a kid. Imagine if you were raising a kid, like a 3-year-old, and 2 3-year-olds.
I am. I can imagine it.
Always testing boundaries, right? They're always testing your boundaries. And if you can tell them, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And if they do it and nothing happens, if you just kind of sit there and yell at them, they're going to keep doing it. And that's just human nature. It's not about being a good person, a bad person. It's just human nature. We operate on incentives. And so unless there is some sort of negative consequence for our actions, we're going to keep doing the action.
What's the impact, though, that it has on our self-worth? Like, if we are in a situation where you're prioritizing maintaining the relationship, keeping the relationship because you're so scared of losing it that therefore you compromise some of those boundaries that you've put in place, what is the negative impact that has? Apart from, having to deal with someone doing the wrong thing in a relationship, more from a self-worth perspective.
So it's a spiral that works in both directions. The downward spiral is you have no self-worth. So you're so desperate to keep the relationship that you let your partner walk all over you and you don't enforce any boundaries because you have no self-worth. And the fact that you don't enforce the boundaries lowers your self-worth, which makes it harder to enforce boundaries, which, and so it's a feedback loop that just keeps going
and deteriorating.
Shitter. But you can spin that around the other way, because as soon as you start enforcing boundaries, what you're essentially telling your unconscious brain is, I matter. My values and my expectations matter. And in this case, they matter more than my partner's behavior. And you are putting into practice that belief. And so that builds self-esteem. And the more you do that, the more self-esteem it builds, the easier it becomes to enforce other boundaries. And so this kind of comes back to why it's to start small and kind of work your way up to the big conversation. And generally what you'll find too is the big conversation will show up anyway if you start the small conversation. Like if you start the conversation about taking the car out without your permission, suddenly you end up at like, well, you never respected me and you fucking cheated on me with this person, and like now everything's out in the open. So but yeah, you need to flip the script and get the spiral working in the other direction.
You spoke about conflict, and you said that, you know, we can talk about boundaries and we can initiate these small conversations, and it's not about having a fight. But is there ever a positive from having like real conflict in your relationship? From like, and I mean, yeah, obviously there's healthy ways to have conflict and very unhealthy ways to have conflict. But surely in some of these instances when you are setting boundaries, it's actually healthy to have a fight and to have some sort of conflict.
You have to have conflict because you're both, again, it comes back to both people are different. Both people have different values. Both people have different expectations for their lives. And sometimes those expectations or values are going to clash or contradict. And so if you're not occasionally having a fight about it, or at least arguing about it, then that probably means both of you aren't being 100% open or forthright with what you feel or believe. This also relates to the trust piece too, because if you never fight about anything, in a way, so, you know, people pleasers, they never want to fight because it's like a fear of abandonment. It's like, well, if I fight about this, then maybe he or she will leave me and then I'll be alone. But if you're never fighting about anything, then you never actually know how either of you really feels. And if you're actually committed to the relationship. If you have the fight and then you wake up the next day and the person's still there and they still love you and they still respect you, then that actually affirms the trust, because you're like, well, we just had this big fight. We see this thing completely differently. We're struggling through it, but they're still here and they're still showing up and they still love me just as much as they did yesterday. And so I think that sense, it's actually really good for the relationship. Yeah, I just think fighting is, again, it can be done in a healthy and an unhealthy way. And I think healthy fighting is not only inevitable, but it's probably good.
Mark, two things I've heard you talk about are inherent sacrifice and opportunity costs. And I think the two link together. And something you said at the very beginning of the episode was, you know, they asked me to do a 20-city book tour. And of course, because I can't say no to an opportunity, I said yes and I jumped in. Can you talk to us about inherent sacrifice, opportunity cost, how they link and what that does for your life in general and a relationship?
Oh, yeah. Anything you prioritize in your life, it means you have to deprioritize something else. And I think this is another thing that a lot of people kind of delude themselves about. You know, you'll meet a guy who works 80 hours a week and he's like, oh, family's everything to me. It's like, well, dude, you haven't been home in like 3 days. So we can trick ourselves a lot by telling ourselves that we value something, but we're continually compromising that thing to chase something else. And so I think, and this is an area where I think I'm a very deep believer that the quality of our relationships with other people is very much a reflection of our relationship with ourselves. So if we are bullshitting ourselves, if I'm telling myself that, you know, oh, my family's everything, I would give up anything for them, and I'm like running off and doing 3-month speaking tours every year, I'm bullshitting myself. Like that's an issue with my relationship with myself. I'm lying to myself. I'm in denial about something. I'm like not owning up to some of my own values and prioritizations. And then that's going to bleed into my relationship with my wife. She's going to be like, well, what the fuck? You're never home. You know, I thought we were number one, and and I'm not going to be prepared for that conversation because I'm lying to myself. So I can't even defend myself properly because I'm just full of shit. So I think we all do this to a certain extent. And I think this is where kind of improving our awareness and our relationship with ourselves has like knock-on effects with other people. And I think for me at that time in my life, I really, I went through a situation where my career just kind of blew up like 10x very, very quickly. Within the span of like a year and a half, I suddenly found myself with all these crazy opportunities that I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm getting offered this right now.
I
And
have to say yes.
I just said yes to everything because shit, who knows if this will ever come around again. And to a certain extent, I don't necessarily regret that, but it definitely ended up causing a lot of problems in other areas of my life because I wasn't aware that I was necessarily deprioritizing other things in my life when I did that.
I actually love this example because I deeply relate to it. And also, I've seen it play out in so many of my friends' relationships. It's so easy to say that the most important thing to you is your family. The most important thing to you is your relationship. And then, I'm doing all this for the family. I'm working so hard to make money so that we can pay off our mortgage and we can do this and do that. But really, and it's a conversation I've had with my husband a lot recently, the reason why I personally work so hard is because I love working. And it's actually not to pay off the mortgage because as much as that's important, we both contribute to it. I think like how do you, I guess, like front up those realizations? Like when you have been, and maybe it's because their priorities shift. So like maybe in that year of your life, those priorities did shift. For that year, the most important thing to you was your work and without realizing it. But then how do you have those conversations around a shift in priorities or making space to juggle both with the people that are important to you? Because we've kind of been fed this idea that you can have it all and you can have it all at the same time and you can do all the things, but we actually fucking can't. And when we try and do it all, we do it all really poorly. So how would you suggest people have those conversations with their partners?
Well, the nice thing, it's funny because back then I did have a conversation with my wife about it. And I remember telling her, saying like, hey, this could be my 15 minutes, right? These are contracts with a lot of zeros at the end of the number. This might go away. So I'm still young. I should probably just say yes to everything. And she was on board. So I think it just comes back to like having like, and it's something you practice as a couple too, of like, hey, I'm in a situation in my life right now. These are my priorities, or this is what makes sense to me. This is kind of where I'm at, what I'm thinking. What do you think? Does that work for you? Is this going to cause problems for you? If it's going to cause problems, like how can we compromise and figure this out? What should the compromise be? I just think that it's like good relationship hygiene to have these check-ins whenever something significant in either of your lives starts happening. And I know there's even some people these days, they'll have like an annual review, like relationship review, where they kind of go through like
a health check.
Like here are 5 categories. Here's how I'm feeling in this category. Here's how I'm feeling about this.
Here's
category.
what you can
Let's
work on.
Everything. It's so unromantic, but it's also so practical. And this kind of comes back to like the long-term relationships are not necessarily fun, but they're good and they're very satisfying. And so that's very different. And so I think having some of these dull conversations about like, how are we feeling about our finances this year? How are we feeling about our intimacy this year? How are we feeling about our relationships with each other's families this year? It's dull as shit, but like it probably needs to be done at least once a year. So anyway, back to 2019. I had that conversation with my wife, and she was totally supportive and on board with it. And it sucked for her. She spent a lot of time at home that year, but it was fine. Like we both kind of signed up for it beforehand. What I didn't consider is how it would affect other areas of my life. The 2 big ones, namely being health and friendships, social relationships. I was never around. I was on the road all the time. I was eating garbage and being jet lagged constantly and drinking way too much. And it took a toll on a number of areas of my life. And again, to your point, I think I naively thought like that I could have it all, that all this other stuff, all these other areas of my life that I had worked really hard on to make sure that they were good and stable, I completely neglected. And by the end of that period, it was kind of a mess.
Was this a very humbling experience for you? And I ask this because as someone who gives advice around like the philosophies of life, of how to be happy, of like what is important in terms of figuring out priorities, to then go through this period yourself where you're like, oh, how did we end up here?
It's terrible. It's like, I can't tell you how many times I would like talk to friends during this period. And I'd be like, man, I'm so stressed out and I don't know what to do and blah, 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 blah. And then my friend would look at me and be like, there's this book called The Subtle Art of Happiness Book. And the guy has this really good point about choosing your problems. And I was just like,
It's so ironic.
But it's really affirming that if like even you can find yourself in these situations and you've done all the work, you've done all the research, like you know the things and the ways to apply it. Like what help to the people who haven't started to kind of chip away at the self-help, like, well yet? What help do they have, And like, I guess it's kind of almost giving yourself a bit of grace that we all go through these periods in life.
But that just comes back to like, think of how many times you can give advice to other people because that's what they should be doing, but you don't take your own advice. And I guess, Mark's not immune to that. he can make his career on giving the advice, but it's a different kettle of fish when you've got to accept it yourself.
I don't think we ever escape these issues. And it's funny because I look back now at like the stuff in subtle, like the stuff in subtle art was very much motivated by the problems in my life previous to subtle art. I naively didn't think about the fact that I would be caught off guard in the same way by the problems post subtle art in the same way. So I just think to a certain extent, so much of this is just baked into our nature. And we constantly have to check ourselves and kind of fight against it. But even then, none of us are going to be perfect. None of us are going to get it right all the time. It's almost like you just get better at stomaching the mistakes and quicker at correcting them than really preventing them at all.
With all the newsletters you've written, with all the thoughts that you've put down pen to paper, what has been the most profound moment where you've been like, well, that was a real life-changing revelation to me? Like, was there something specific that happened to you, or was there a specific teaching that you were like, this had the biggest effect on my life personally?
Oh, man.
Too many.
Yeah, right? Well, it's hard because at this point I've been doing this for almost 15 years. And I think like anybody, it's almost like you have like a greatest hits album from each decade of your life. It's like I can look at my 20s and I'm like, yeah, those 3 or 4 moments are kind of top of the charts. And my 30s are kind of shaping up the same way. There are a handful of moments that were really formative. But it's hard to point to just one. I know that's kind of a cop out, but what I try to do with my work is to just stay as honest as possible with, I guess, kind of whatever I'm thinking about and whatever I'm going through, so that it does evolve along kind of in parallel as my personal evolution. And I'm always very careful to like never hide the fact that I fuck these things up too. Because I think one of the things that I always disliked about the self-help industry is kind of this guru idea of like, this is the guy on stage who's got it all figured out. I just think that's bullshit. I think that's completely unrealistic. I think it's much more valuable to be open about the fact that, like, hey, I got over that shit that I wrote about in my 20s, but now I'm pushing 40 and it's a whole new bag of problems that I'm struggling with. So
I think that's going to be our title of the episode.
I'm pushing 40.
No,
pushing
no.
40.
I fuck this stuff up too. I think that's really important. I think what you just said, everybody makes mistakes. It doesn't matter how many times you give yourself your own advice. You live and you learn, and you're not also going to always agree with something that you put out to the world 15 years ago. Laura and I think that all the time. Like, we have 500 episodes, and I think if we went back and listened to some things we've said, our opinions probably changed on that in some capacity, because you grow with life, problems hit you differently, and I think it's human nature. It's part of the cycle. Mark, What are the 3 questions that we can ask ourselves that determine 99% of happiness?
I'm so glad you asked. I think about this all the time.
There may have been a conversation that just got deleted if this seems like a very different energy that you're listening to.
All right. No, the 3 questions that determine 99% of your happiness is who are you spending your time with? What are you spending your time working on? And how well are you treating your body?
Yeah.
Why are they the 3 most important? And what is it about those questions that you feel as though, because I do want to speak to you about happiness. We wrote a chapter in our book, We Love Love, and I had a quote from something that you had said on our podcast that made it into that chapter, because I love the way in which you talk about happiness as this construct that we're all kind of trying to get to, but like, what does that actually mean?
It's fun with psychological concepts. This stuff's not complicated. Humans are not. Our psychology has not changed at all in the last 10,000 years. Society has changed. So I think we have a tendency to make this stuff way more complicated than it actually is. I think the actual challenge is staying with the simplicity of this stuff. And if you look at the research on what drives life satisfaction, the vast majority of it really comes down to, are you surrounded by people who care about you and that you care about? Are you working on something that feels meaningful or worthwhile? And are you not treating your body like shit? Like, are you sleeping a decent amount? Are you eating relatively healthy? Are you not, drinking or doing drugs every night? As long as you're basically doing decently on all 3 of those things, you're probably going to be a relatively happy person. You may not be like maxed out, skipping down the sidewalk every morning, but who is? It's really, and if you're lacking in one of those 3 categories, then you're definitely going to feel it. And so I think sometimes people get so caught up in all these productivity systems and like lifestyle seminars and crazy relationship courses and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, are those 3 things in check? Because if they're not, just start there. That's the most basic and fundamental thing you can do. It's not exciting. It's not sexy. Doesn't market super well, but that's actually probably what most people need to hear.
I also think we have such an aversion to feeling anything other than that, because no one wants to feel uncomfortable. No one wants to feel sad. No one wants to feel angry. No one wants to feel grief, like all of those feelings. But they are a fundamental and equally as valid and important part of the cycle of life as happiness is. But we work so hard not to feel any of those things. And sometimes when you're fighting so much against it, then you're going to give yourself anxiety. So you're going to have something else to deal with. I guess in terms of this happiness trope, what do you think is more important to be working towards?
I think it's all 3 of those. You should have all 3 of those categories at least a 7 out of 10. And I think as long as you've got all 3 of them there, you're probably in a good spot. I think the mistake a lot of people make is that they'll kill themselves to get one of the categories as a 10 out of 10. And then they'll sacrifice the other 2 to get there. So they'll completely screw their relationships and screw their health, like I did, to get what they're working on at a 10 out of 10, or they'll screw what they're working on and screw their relationships to get their health at a 10 out of 10. It's really just try to be a 7 or 8 at all 3 of them. And that's basically a life well lived.
I also like I think one of the ones and the relationships that we deprioritize is often friendship. And that's one that you touched on in terms of your own personal life. Like, we put so much importance and so much weight on romantic relationships, but I don't think that friendships get enough airtime, and they're so important to our general happiness and to fulfilling the cup in other areas. And also kind of lightening the load on our romantic relationships, so we're not expecting every single thing from that person.
Yeah, I feel like friendships are underrated, especially in this day and age. It's interesting if you look at research on people who are just single. by and large, they're not any less happy than people who are in relationships. I think people who are married are slightly happier, but it also that varies a lot based on the quality of the marriage. The point is that nobody's miserable, like as an average on a population level. People aren't miserable if they're not in a relationship. But if you look at friendships, if you look at people who don't have friendships, it's fucking death. Like it's people with no social ties or relationships, their life expectancy is shorter than smokers, alcoholics, people who play in traffic. It's one of the worst things you can do for yourself.
People who play in traffic.
It's like it's scientifically validated.
I understand. I understand the point. It was very graphic.
It's shocking. If you look at the psychological data on people, on like loneliness and people who don't have any significant social connect, it's shocking. It's shockingly bad. It's absolutely atrocious.
Yeah, and I which is why I think there needs to be this reframe, because I know that romantic relationships are important, and I can't tell you how many questions we receive from people who say, my friends are in relationships and it's all I want, and I can't stand another baby announcement, I can't stand another happy couple photo. And I think that and I understand why. It's very easy to be in a relationship and then be like, don't worry about wanting to be in a relationship. But at the same time, I do think that sometimes we devalue how important friendships are and how much they can fill the space of the longing for a romantic relationship. And often people get into romantic relationships and then they discard their friendships because there's this new thing that's come along.
Yeah, I think that's really unhealthy. I think in general, it's unhealthy to make your romantic relationship your identity in your life. It's healthy for both people to maintain an independent identity outside of the relationship. But the other caveat of that, of what you just said, is that if you're not able to be happy single, then you're going to attract a bad relationship.
Yeah.
Like it's only people who are happy single that attract happy relationships, because they're already happy with themselves. They have their own identity. They feel very satisfied with their lives. They've got friends. They've got hobbies. They've got careers. It's the people who feel like they're lacking something, who like I don't have a relationship. My life sucks. This is miserable. They're the ones who are going to settle for somebody who doesn't treat them well. They're the ones who are going to not put up boundaries and enforce healthy boundaries or have good communication within the relationships. They're going to invite a toxic relationship into their life, and it's not going to solve anything.
I've spoken many a times on the podcast about how I was single for the better part of 10 years, and how I lived alone for most of that time. I traveled alone, and I was really, really happy. But one thing I can say now that I haven't said is that I've been in a relationship for a year now, and my happiness isn't more and it's not less, but it's different. So my happiness level is the same. I don't feel like I'm more complete because I've been in a relationship. I don't feel exponentially happier, but the happiness has shifted in the way that I feel it. And that's because I think it's really important to have all these other aspects of your life, the hobbies, the travel, the friends. And yeah, it's like Laura said, we really want to drive that home, because a lot of people automatically link being single with like it's the worst time of your life and you couldn't get lower and you're so unwanted and so unloved, which is ridiculous.
But it is hard when you live in a world of social media, and
of course,
people's relationships look so good. Like people, of course, we know it's a highlight reel, but it equates to the highlight reel for relationships too. And
this is just personal anecdote, but what I've noticed in my personal life is that the couples that are always posting the perfect pictures and everything's amazing and oh my God, we're so happy all the time, those are the couples that are miserable and constantly fighting and just completely toxic. And they're usually the ones that end up getting divorced too, in my experience. And it's like, when I think about all the happiest couples that I know, they never post, it's very rare, maybe an anniversary or a Christmas or something, and they'll post a little bit of, a photo or two, but it's not this constant barrage of, look at my life, look how great it is. So I think it's important for people to keep perspective about that. a little bit.
I 100% agree. And I know that probably to our listeners, there's going to be some irony in that because we have very public Instagrams. Like, so my husband, he was the bachelor in Australia. We're now married. We have children together and we are very, very fucking happy. But we also keep it very real in talking about the fact that Instagram's the highlight and we talk about all the rest of the shit on the podcast. Do you know what I mean? So it's got a balance to it. But I see it in people who are in my life, who are friends, who I know the intricacies of their relationships. I know some of the big struggles that they've been through. And then I see the incredible, like loving accolade post of like, oh, you know, you're my amazing husband. And I'm like, your husband's fucking sucks.
Yeah, your husband's cheating on you.
Yeah, like I see that play out. And I think we all do in different ways, but it is still hard to sometimes, you know, especially when you're longing for it, to kind of see the forest through the trees, I guess.
For sure.
So, Mark, it's a new year. What do you think about New Year's resolutions? Do you think it's something that we set like unrealistic expectations for ourselves? Do you think it's something that we should stop doing? Do you think it's a motivation?
Clean slate.
Yeah, because like, you know, new year, new me, because it's fucking never new you. It's like it's the same you. It's the same you that might try a bit harder.
But sometimes it's nice. Sometimes it's nice to think it'll be a new you.
I think it's fine. I think it's a good habit to periodically kind of sit down and ask yourself, how would I like to change in my life? And then set goals around that. Like, I think that's just a healthy practice. And the fact that New Year's gets so many people to do that, and in many cases, it's probably the only time during the year that they do that. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think the problem is most people just are maybe a little bit undereducated in terms of what goals to pursue and maybe realistic means of pursuing them. Just because I think the stereotype, right, is everybody at New Year's is like, I'm going to finally lose that 10 kilo or whatever. And, you know, they join the gym and by February, they're back on the couch.
February is generous. It's like middle of Jan.
Yeah, right. I just think it's, I've written on my website a few times that I think we should kind of change the narrative away from goals to habits. Instead of like, what goals am I setting this year? It should be like, what habit am I going to adopt this year that I haven't had in the past? Just because habits are way more sustainable. You know, goals, you get this like initial burst of excitement. You go to the gym a few times, but by like the second or third week, it becomes a chore. And so I think that having a more realistic expectation of like, okay, I'm not setting a goal. I'm trying to build a habit. What's the habit I'm going to build? I'm going to start small. I'm going to like plan it into my day, set up incentives for myself, get a friend on board. You know, like if you can do all those things, then you're actually like way, way, way more likely to succeed. And then once you have the habit, then you actually are a new person. But it's, you know, until you actually have done the thing dozens of times, it's just wishful thinking.
Mark, every week on our podcast, we do Ask Uncut, where we have so many of our listeners write in with their life questions, the things that they're facing. And being that this is something that you are literally an expert in and something that you deal with every day to day in your own community, we wanted to bring you some of our Ask Uncut questions and get your take on what would be the right way for our listeners to navigate the issues that they have in their life. All right, question number 1.
I'm having a bit of a quarter, hopefully maybe third, life crisis, and I think I need your advice. After finishing school, I took a gap year and worked/went on a few holidays here and there. I then went to uni, did a Bachelor of Business. I finished, got a job essentially working in marketing. I've been there for just over 2 years now. It's a decent job. My pay is fine. I get along with most of the people I work with. I don't really know why, but I just feel like something huge is missing in my life. Some days I feel like I want to quit my job, kind of blow up my life, go traveling or move somewhere different. But then I don't really want to throw away what I've got and what I've built because it's a pretty good situation. I guess I'm wondering if this is just how it is when you have a full-time job and I need to get over it, or whether I'm just not going to be happy doing this forever. I think everyone has felt this conundrum.
Totally.
I feel isn't this when we like look at the young people and we're like, welcome to adulthood.
I was going to say, she's like, is this just adulthood? Yes.
This is certainly part of it. I would just say that I think one thing that happens a lot of times is when people aren't happy, they overestimate how much needs to change to actually make them happy, you know? So instead of just maybe I need a job that I like a little bit more, which is probably the case here, they think, oh, I should just blow everything up and move to a new country and, you know, completely just become a surf instructor. You know, it's like, whoa. You don't need to
You don't
like,
surf.
let's step back from the edge. Yeah, you don't surf. So let's start with square one. You know, I would start here with simply, why don't you look around at other jobs in your industry that you're qualified for? Maybe it could be something as simple as changing the company you work for. It could be something as simple as changing the work culture that you work in. It could be as simple as like moving to a different town. It's start small, see if that changes anything. If it doesn't, at least it gives you a lot more information. Like if you're miserable at 2 companies, that tells you something. So, start simple. Don't blow everything up.
I agree, but what I will say is, you know, I fall into this. I'm 36. I'm not 20. I haven't just started my career. I'm 36 and I'm living my dream job. You know, I'm a radio host and I do a podcast host. I get to interview people like you, and I've traveled the world. I've been to nearly 60 countries, but I don't reckon there's a week that goes by that I don't want to pack up and move to another country. I still have that pull, and I'm like, I'm good. Like I love my life, but I still have that pull to go, and I have a real struggle with FOMO of the world, like of the entire world. I'm like, there are so many different cultures out there and people and languages and experiences, and I'm not living them. And that's a constant battle I have. But I think the happy medium is, you know, and maybe this girl, she's young, maybe she should pack up and go and move to the other side of the world for a couple of years. But there's no reason you can't move to London, get a visa, and still work in your job, get a marketing job over there, but see if the different environment helps you in some capacity, because some people won't ever outgrow that feeling, but there are little things you can do to get that balance. Maybe it's a few more extra trips, a few long weekends here or there to try and fill that cup. But some people will just like never grow out of it.
Yeah, but I also think, I mean, my only input of this is that I think that age and circumstances are a defining factor. If you're 21 and you are having these urges, you're way more inclined to explore them. And to kind of learn the lessons yourself than if you're 37, have 2 kids and are married, you know. So like, I think it's dependent.
Do it while you can.
Yeah, it's dependent on where you are in your life. Yeah. And if those urges are profound and you want to do them when you're young, then there's not going to be any backlash of packing your life up and going fuck it for a couple of years and doing that. Whereas the fallout would be far more significant later in life. And I think that's the scale. You know, if you do have another marketing job, you do feel the same, and you do then need to make a decision for yourself, what's the fallout going to be? Where are you at in your life that the impact is going to, you know, hurt other people or other things? What are the consequences? And if they're minimal, then go for it. And if they're huge, then maybe consider how much of an arsehole it would make you if you went and did all those things, because it would impact a lot of other people.
Totally.
Last thing I want to say is...
Oh, good. Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I love the point. One thing, I wrote an article years and years ago, but one of the things I said, even your dream job sucks 30% of the time.
Totally. Yeah. Even your dream partner sucks 30% of the time.
Totally.
Sorry, Matt.
Absolutely.
No, I mean it. Like
Totally.
the person of your dreams who ticks every box, who is actually incredible and way better than anyone else you've ever dated, still is going to irritate you and suck sometimes. It's just going to happen.
And I think this leans into a lot of and I feel like we've mentioned it a few times, you know, it's the sunk cost fallacy. She's like, I've done it for 2 years now. I've really invested in the job and the degree, and I don't want to waste that time. But again, it's not wasting the time, because you've still learned a skill. You've still been paying the bills. You've still, you know, this isn't a waste of time in any capacity.
And you've also learned what you don't want, which is really valuable.
Okay, I have a question for you. I've been with my boyfriend now for 3 years. I'm 22, he's 26. We lived together for the past year. Our relationship is good with no huge red flags. That's good. He treats me well, and I'm starting to find that he treats me well, but I'm starting to find he's becoming quite hard to motivate. What I mean by this is that he sleeps in every day. He works from home, so sometimes he doesn't leave the house. He doesn't really seem enthusiastic about doing anything at all, whether it be with me or exercise. We have been wanting to plan a trip to Europe for a long time, but I'm basically becoming solely responsible for the planning. I don't think he's depressed, but I'm finding it a lot of work to be the only one trying to get us up and go and do anything. Is he becoming really lazy? Are we just not on the same path? Or do you think that there might be something deeper going on here? Dum, dum, dum.
It does. To me, it sounds like he's a little bit depressed. I mean, those are the sorts of behaviors that happens when somebody. I mean, clearly he's going through something, and I think this is a perfect example of how whatever you're going through yourself bleeds over into your relationship. I mean, I'm gonna guess it's not about her or the relationship, because if it was, they would be fighting about stuff or be having it, like, she wouldn't say the relationship is good. So the fact that she says the relationship is good, yet he's can't get out of bed in the morning, he doesn't want to do anything, he doesn't want to, like, even things that he said he wanted to do a year ago, he said he doesn't really show much interest in doing anymore. I mean, something's going on with him. He's clearly unhappy in some way, and I think, you know, her I don't want to say job or role, because it's not an obligation, but like, as his partner, she should try to kind of help him figure that out. He probably doesn't fully understand what's going on with him. So, you know, I think this is a great opportunity for her to, you know, try to help him with that.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think it's easy to say, "Oh, I don't think he's depressed," because your relationship's not, as in like, you're not fighting. So like, I think if you were fighting and there was like problems, you would probably be more inclined to be like, "Oh, I think he's depressed," because it's having an impact on your relationship. But because you're like, everything else seems fine, we are fine, but this is just a him problem. But I think that's how depression can manifest. It very much can look like just a him problem.
But sometimes some people, like myself included, just aren't planners. Like, some people aren't motivated by being organized and planned. So
yeah, but
maybe
different.
there's an aspect of that is being intensified by what he's going through inside.
Yeah, but I think it's that's one thing. I'm not a planner. Like, unfortunately, it kind of is always up to my partner to do all of the organization, but I get out of bed in the morning. Like, it's all the factors linked together that to me would say exactly what you said, Mark. There's something much deeper going on here. And rather than pointing it as lazy, I would be saying, like, why has his behavior changed? What's changed? Yeah. And something has changed.
People don't magically become lazy at 26.
Yeah.
If anything, they magically stop being lazy at 26. In my experience, it's if I was to make a list of all of the initial signs of depression, I mean, let me put it this way. It seems like maybe she isn't clear on what depression is, but depression is a lack of interest in things that you used to be interested in. And so I would say that them not fighting is actually also evidence of depression, because when you're depressed, you don't care enough to fight with your partner.
Yeah.
It's like, if I'm depressed and my wife's doing something that irritates me, I'm like, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
To yell at her. Like, I'm just gonna like roll over and pull the covers over my head. You know, so it sounds like he's going through something right now. And I think this is a great opportunity for her to try to I think young men really struggle to be aware of what they're feeling and what they're going through. I'm sure he's aware that he's not motivated to do stuff, but if he's like most young men, he's probably not aware why he's not motivated to do stuff. And I know when I was younger, my girlfriends were always very, very instrumental in helping me, kind of being like, "Hey, what's going on? Like, how are you feeling? Why don't you want to do this? You were excited about this a month ago. Like, why don't you want to do this now?"
What's changed?
It's sometimes guys, especially young guys, like, you need to prod them a little bit to get them to kind of like, "Oh yeah, I am kind of feeling this way. Yeah, that sucks. I wonder why, huh?"
You can get Mark's books literally anywhere in the entire world that you can get a book. They're bestsellers in every country, and you can listen to your new podcast.
We also highly recommend going to his speaking tours, but maybe book it if it's at the end of the speaking tour, not the start.
Yeah, I mean, if for all the Aussies I'll probably be. You'll probably catch me once I'm a little bit rehearsed, and the sex robots have been cut out of the talk.
Yeah.
So.
Are you making your way back this way anytime soon?
No plans at the moment. I'd love to though. I mean, I love Australia. Is like it's one of my best markets. I love it down there. Always have great events down there. So I'm sure I'll be back one day, but no plans.
No, Mark, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you guys.